The Shadow in the Portrait. Chapter 1. The Echo of a Name. The air in the sterile hospital room in Charleston, South Carolina, was thick with a scent of antiseptic and the heavier perfume of fading life. Eleanor Vance, 40 years old, a restorer of ancient photographs, held her father's frail hand. Richard Vance, a photographer himself, a man who had always seen the world through a lens, was dying. His breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, each one a grim countdown. Ellie had spent countless hours by his bedside these past weeks, listening to the soft murmur of the machines, the hushed footsteps of nurses. Tonight, the murmurs were different. Richard's eyes, usually so clear and kind, were clouded with delirium. He looked at Ellie, a strange, faraway light in their depths, and whispered, "Charlotte, my sweet Charlotte." Ellie froze. Charlotte? Her name was Eleanor. Ellie. There was no Charlotte in their family. Not that she knew of, anyway. She squeezed his hand gently. "Dad? It's Ellie. I'm here." He blinked, a momentary flicker of recognition. Then the cloud descended again. "Charlotte, don't go. Not again." His voice was a thin thread unraveling. Ellie's heart ached. Delirium, of course. The drugs, the fever. It was just the mind playing tricks, conjuring phantom names from the depths of memory. A side effect of the inevitable letting go. She dismissed it, tucking the strange utterance away in the back of her mind. A fleeting, painful echo. 3 days later, Richard was gone. The world shifted. The silence in their Charleston home, once filled with the quiet click of her father's camera and the scent of darkroom chemicals, was now a cavernous void. The task of sorting through her father's studio, his beloved darkroom, fell to Ellie. It was a sacred space, filled with the ghosts of images captured and developed. She worked slowly, reverently through stacks of negatives, old prints, vintage cameras, and the distinct nostalgic smell of photographic fixer. Each item was a relic, a piece of her father's soul. In a dusty corner, behind a sliding false panel, in a built-in bookshelf that Ellie had never noticed before, she found it. A small, leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with age, its pages brittle. It looked ancient, far older than anything else in her father's collection. Tucked inside its tattered pages, a single faded photograph. Ellie pulled out the photo first. It was a portrait, sepia-toned, of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. She had wide, curious eyes, dark, curly hair, and a small, distinctive mole just above her right eyebrow. Ellie's breath hitched. A jolt like an electric shock ran through her. She stared at the image, her heart pounding. The girl in the photograph. She looked exactly like Ellie did as a child. The same eyes, the same hair, even the same mole. It was unsettling, almost chilling. She flipped the photo over, her fingers trembling. Scrawled on the back, in her father's familiar, elegant script, were 2 words: Charlotte, Savannah, 1980. Charlotte, the name that had haunted her father's dying breath. Savannah, not Charleston. And the date, 1980. Ellie was born in 1985. This wasn't her. It couldn't be. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. A mirror image from a past that wasn't hers. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. Who was Charlotte? And why did she look exactly like Ellie? Chapter 2. Pages of a Parallel Life. The diary felt heavy in Ellie's hands, heavier than its small size suggested. A Pandora's box, perhaps, or a portal to a past she never knew existed. She carried it to her own restoration studio, a sunlit room filled with the delicate tools of her trade: magnifying glasses, fine brushes, archival paper. Surrounded by the ghosts of other people's memories, she felt a strange sense of ironic purpose. She was usually the one piecing together fragments of unknown lives. Now she was doing it for her own. She opened the diary to the first entry. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, but younger, more vibrant. The date, June 12th, 1978. Anna is pregnant. A miracle. I can't wait to be a father. Anna, her father's first wife, she knew. Richard had been married briefly before her mother, Sarah. The marriage ended quickly. Her mother had always said, due to circumstances, a vague, dismissive explanation that Ellie had never questioned. Until now. Ellie continued to read, mesmerized, a growing sense of unreality washing over her. The diary chronicled the joyful anticipation of a first child, the nursery being painted, the endless discussions about names. Charlotte, we both love Charlotte, our little southern belle. The entries were full of a father's boundless love, a photographer's keen eye for detail. Descriptions of Charlotte's first steps, her infectious giggle, her fascination with light and shadow. He detailed the small, ordinary moments that become precious memories. Charlotte giggled today when I pointed the camera at her. She has a natural grace even at 2 years old. He described her favorite psalms, simple nursery rhymes, and surprisingly, an old blues tune that Ellie herself had always inexplicably loved. The narrative unfolded, painting a vivid picture of a happy, idyllic early childhood in Savannah, Georgia. Richard's entries were punctuated by his own sketches, quick, tender charcoal drawings of Charlotte, playing in a sun-dappled garden, holding a worn teddy bear. Each sketch confirmed the uncanny resemblance to Ellie's own childhood photographs. A profound sense of disorientation settled over Ellie. This wasn't just a story. This was her story, or a version of it, but with another girl, another name, in another time. It felt like looking into a distorted mirror, seeing a reflection that was almost hers, but fundamentally not. Then, the tone of the diary shifted. The entries became shorter, darker, laced with an escalating dread. Late 1984. Charlotte has been so quiet lately. The cough won't go away. We're so worried. And then a series of blank pages, followed by a single, shattering entry. October 27th, 1984. She's gone. My Charlotte, my sweet girl. The river, it took her. We tried everything. The fever, the weakness. She slipped away. How can the world keep turning? Ellie gasped, a choked sob escaping her lips. Tears blurred the faded ink. Charlotte had drowned. A child. Her father's child. The river. The specific chilling details resonated with a peculiar, unsettling familiarity. Ellie had had recurring nightmares as a child. Vivid, terrifying dreams of being pulled under murky water, of struggling against an unseen current. She had always dismissed them as just bad dreams. Now they felt like echoes. The entries after Charlotte's death were a descent into raw grief. Richard wrote of Anna's inconsolable despair, her rapid decline. Anna fades a little more each day. She sees Charlotte everywhere, yet nowhere. This house is a tomb of what was. A few months later, another entry. Anna left me today, not for the river, but for the silence. She couldn't live without her. I don't know how I can either. Ellie wiped her tears. So, her father's first wife, Anna, had died shortly after Charlotte. Her mother had simply said the marriage ended, not that his wife had died of a broken heart. Another layer of silence, another hidden truth. The diary then jumped forward abruptly. Richard described his aimless wandering, his move to New Orleans, seeking escape from the ghosts of Savannah. And then a new name appeared, Sarah, a gentle soul. She's an anchor in the storm. Perhaps there can be light again. The diary ended shortly after, with an entry about their wedding and the hopeful anticipation of a new life. There was no mention of Ellie's birth, no mention of her. The profound silence where her own story should have begun was deafening. Ellie's mind reeled. If Charlotte died in October 1984 and Ellie was born in 1985, could it be? Was she a replacement, a second chance? The uncanny resemblance, the shared birthmark, the haunting dreams, the name her father whispered. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening precision. She wasn't just Eleanor Vance. She was the shadow in the portrait, the echo of a lost child. Chapter 3. The Mother's Silence. The phone felt heavy in Ellie's hand, heavier than the diary itself. Her mother, Sarah, was still in Charleston, staying at the family home, managing the funeral arrangements. Ellie had to confront her. She had to know. "Mom," Ellie began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. "I found something in Dad's studio, a diary." A beat of silence. "Oh? Richard kept a diary? He was always so private." Sarah's voice was even, too even. "Yes, and a photo of a girl named Charlotte. She looks exactly like me, and she died in 1984. Dad called me Charlotte when he was, dying." Another, longer silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Ellie, that's just a coincidence. Your father was very ill. People say strange things, and that photo, it must be someone else's. He had so many old photographs." "No, Mom. It's written on the back. Charlotte, Savannah, 1980. And the diary. He wrote about her death, about Anna dying too." Ellie's voice rose, edged with desperation. "Mom, who was she? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sarah's response was a brittle, almost fierce defensiveness. "Ellie, listen to me. Your father, he went through a terrible time, a dark time. That was his past. We built a new life, a new family, a happy one. There was no need to dredge up old sorrows. It would only cause pain." "Pain for whom, Mom? For me? For him? Or for you?" Ellie pressed, a bitter edge entering her voice. "Did you know about Charlotte? Did you know she looked like me?" Sarah sighed, a ragged, exhausted sound. "He spoke of her. Of course he did. Briefly. He was broken. I wanted to help him. We wanted to move forward, to leave the past behind." "But you didn't leave it behind, Mom. He kept a diary, a photograph. He whispered her name on his deathbed. Did he ever think I was her? Did you both let him believe that?" The words tumbled out, accusations mixed with raw fear. Sarah's voice dropped, barely audible. "He loved you, Ellie. More than anything. You were his whole world." "But whose world, Mom? Charlotte's or mine?" Ellie's voice cracked. Was I adopted? Is that why I look like her? Did you find a baby who looked like her and bring me home as a replacement?" The silence stretched, a vast, echoing chasm. Ellie waited, heart pounding, for the denial, the explanation. But none came, just the sound of her mother's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Ellie, please, come home. Let's talk about this in person. It's complicated. More complicated than you know." Ellie hung up, her hands shaking. The lack of outright denial, the plea for a face-to-face conversation, spoke volumes. The knot in her stomach tightened, twisting into a painful certainty. Her identity, her entire life story, was built on a foundation of unspoken grief and desperate hope. She was the shadow in the portrait, living a life that had been, perhaps unconsciously assigned to her. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Familiar. Ellie drove back to the family home, the Charleston streets a blur outside her window. The familiar grandeur of the old house, with its wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, now felt alien, almost menacing. Every corner seemed to hold a whispered secret. Her mother, Sarah, was waiting for her, her face drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She held out her arms, and Ellie, despite her anger and confusion, fell into them. The embrace was tight, desperate, filled with decades of unspoken pain. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," Sarah whispered into her hair. So sorry. We never meant to hurt you." They sat in the living room, surrounded by familiar photographs of Ellie's childhood, first steps, school plays, graduations. Each one now felt like a carefully constructed illusion. Sarah began to tell her story, slowly, painfully, each word a confession. After Anna, after Charlotte, Richard was shattered, beyond broken. He moved to New Orleans, just like he wrote. He was drinking, barely eating, a ghost. I was a young nurse working in a small maternity clinic that also functioned as a kind of impromptu orphanage for abandoned babies. Sarah's voice caught. Then you arrived. You were a tiny thing, just a few weeks old, left on our doorstep. No name, no history. And you looked so much like the photographs Richard carried everywhere of Charlotte. The same eyes, the same little mole. Ellie's mind raced. "So I was adopted?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Richard, he saw you, and something in his eyes lit up for the first time since he said it was a sign, a second chance, that Charlotte had sent you back to him. He was so fragile, Ellie, so lost. I loved him. I couldn't bear to see him destroyed." "So you let him believe I was Charlotte reborn?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. The idea was monstrous, yet heartbreakingly human. Not exactly let him believe," Sarah corrected, her voice pleading. "He needed to believe it. It was his way of surviving. And you were so precious, so beautiful. We adopted you, legally. We never told you about Charlotte, or the adoption. We didn't want you to feel like a replacement. We wanted you to be whole, to be our daughter. We thought it was better this way, to protect you, to protect him, to protect our family." Ellie stared at her mother, a dizzying mix of emotions swirling within her. Anger, sadness, profound bewilderment, and a strange, unexpected current of understanding. They had lied, yes, a lifetime of lies, but it was a lie born of desperation, of a parent's unbearable grief, and a partner's profound love and desire to heal. "All those things," Ellie murmured, "my nightmares about drowning, my inexplicable love for old blues songs, were those echoes of Charlotte?" Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with pain. Richard played her favorite songs constantly after she left. "And the nightmares. You had them as a baby, too. We just thought it was a common childhood fear. We didn't connect it. We just comforted you." The pieces of Ellie's life, once a familiar puzzle, now shattered, rearranged into a startlingly new and complex mosaic. Her identity wasn't just hers. It was intertwined with another girl's, a ghost child she had never known, whose life had cast a long, beautiful, and ultimately tragic shadow over her own. Chapter 5. The genes speak. Despite her mother's tearful confession, a part of Ellie needed more. Scientific validation. Irrefutable proof. As a photo restorer, she believed in evidence, in the tangible truth revealed through careful scrutiny. She knew about DNA testing, the modern marvel that could unravel even the most tangled family trees. She found a reputable genealogy service and ordered a DNA kit. The process was simple: a swab of saliva, sent off to a lab, and then a period of agonizing waiting. During this time, Ellie revisited her father's diary. With her newfound knowledge, the words took on an even deeper resonance. She could almost feel the weight of his grief, the desperate hope he placed in her arrival. She also started to examine the faded photograph of Charlotte more closely, seemed to have faint indications of alteration. The lighting on Charlotte's face, while beautiful, felt almost enhanced. Ellie brought the photo to her studio, placing it under her magnifying lamp. She used her finest brushes, her restoration liquids, not to change it, but to strip away the years of fading, to reveal any underlying layers. She started with the edges, then moved inwards. She saw it, faint, almost imperceptible lines, traces of a previous version of the image. It wasn't obvious, not to the untrained eye, but Ellie's expertise screamed at her. This photograph had been retouched, not just faded, but subtly altered. A faint blurring around Charlotte's face, making the resemblance to Ellie even more striking. It was skillfully done, a testament to her father's photographic talent. But it was there. The realization was a punch to the gut. Not only had she been adopted, but her father, in his grief, had seemingly manipulated the image of his lost daughter to make her look even more like the baby who would become Ellie. It was a profound act of love, mixed with a deeply unsettling deception. While waiting for the DNA results, Ellie decided to seek external validation for the diary's contents. She contacted Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned genealogist and expert in historical documents, based in Savannah. Dr. Reed was known for her meticulous research and her compassionate approach to uncovering family secrets. Ellie explained her predicament, cautiously at first, then more openly as Dr. Reed listened with professional empathy. She sent her scans of the diary pages, the photograph, and the newspaper clipping of Evelyn Vance's disappearance from Elmwood Asylum, a detail that, ironically, Ellie had discovered during her previous family mystery, which now seemed almost quaint compared to her own. A few days later, Dr. Reed called. "Miss Vance," her voice was calm, reassuring. "I've cross-referenced your father's diary entries with birth and death records from Savannah for the period mentioned. The records confirm the birth of a Charlotte Vance to a Richard and Anna Vance in 1979, and a death record for a Charlotte Vance, age 5, in October 1984 due to drowning in the Savannah River, and a death record for Anna Vance a few months later, cause of death listed as cardiac arrest exacerbated by emotional distress." Ellie listened, a strange mix of dread and morbid fascination washing over her. The facts, cold and clinical, solidified the painful truth. Charlotte was real. Her death was real. Her father's grief and her mother's desperate attempt to ease it were real. I also found a record of Richard Vance's second marriage to a Sarah Peterson in New Orleans in late 1984, Dr. Reed continued, and an adoption record from the same city, dated 1985, for an infant, Eleanor Vance, adopted by Richard and Sarah Vance. The original birth parents are listed as unknown. The DNA results arrived a week later. Ellie opened the email with trembling hands. The results were clear. She had no immediate familial genetic match to any of the Vance family members in the database. Her DNA profile was unique. The test confirmed what her mother had confessed. She was not biologically related to Richard Vance, and therefore not biologically related to Charlotte. The truth, once a shadowy whisper, now stood in stark, undeniable relief. She was adopted. She was not Charlotte. She was Ellie. But her life, her very essence, had been shaped by the lingering presence of a ghost child, the parallel life that her parents, in their profound grief and love, had overlaid onto hers. Chapter 6: The Unveiling of Sarah's Pain. Armed with the irrefutable proof of the DNA results and the professional confirmation from Dr. Reed, Ellie returned to her mother. The conversation this time was different. Less about accusation, more about understanding. Sarah, seeing the evidence laid bare, finally let go of the last vestiges of her protective facade. Her story, once halting and fragmented, now flowed freely, a painful river of confession. "I loved him so much, Ellie," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. "When I met Richard in New Orleans, he was utterly broken, a shell of a man. He carried Charlotte's photograph everywhere, showed it to everyone. He spoke of her constantly, as if she were still alive. It was heartbreaking." Sarah, who had grown up with a distant, emotionally unavailable mother, recognized the depth of Richard's pain. She saw a chance to heal him, to get him back his joy. "And then you came," she said, her eyes welling up again. "You were so small, so perfect, and you looked so much like her. It was uncanny. It was a miracle," Richard said. He saw it as a sign, a second chance from God. "So you went along with it?" Ellie asked gently, trying to understand the enormity of the deception. I didn't know what else to do," Sarah confessed, her voice filled with desperate sincerity. "He was so fragile, and he lit up when he saw you. He found joy again. He finally started to eat, to sleep. He laughed. For the first time in years, he laughed. I couldn't take that away from him. I wanted him to be happy. I wanted us to be happy." She admitted to the subtle alterations to Charlotte's photograph, which Richard had done. "He spent hours in the darkroom, trying to make her look more like you, to make the resemblance even stronger. It was his way of coping, his way of seeing Charlotte in you. It was beautiful in a tragic sort of way." Sarah confessed how they had moved to Charleston shortly after, a deliberate move to distance themselves from the memories of Savannah and the orphanage in New Orleans. They had immersed themselves in their new life, fiercely protecting the secret, creating a narrative where Ellie was simply their biological daughter, their only child. "Every time you had those nightmares or hummed those old songs, my heart would stop," Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I was terrified you would remember, that you would know, that you would hate us for it." Ellie reached across the table and took her mother's hand. The anger was still there, a dull ache, but it was now laced with a profound empathy. She saw the depth of her mother's sacrifice, the years of carrying this enormous burden, the quiet strength it must have taken to maintain such a grand, desperate illusion. "I don't hate you, Mom," Ellie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I understand. It was a different time, and you loved him, and you loved me." Sarah nodded, clutching Ellie's hand. "We loved you fiercely, Ellie. You were never a replacement. You were our daughter. Always. We couldn't face the idea of losing you too by telling you. We were afraid the truth would break our family apart." The truth hadn't broken them. Instead, It had paradoxically brought them closer, forging a new, stronger bond built on raw honesty and shared pain. The shadow of Charlotte, once a source of confusion and existential dread, was now a bridge, connecting generations through a complex tapestry of love, loss, and the lengths people go to for those they cherish. Chapter 7, Two Portraits, One Legacy. Ellie sat in her studio, surrounded by her tools, her work, her life. On her workbench she had two photographs. One, the original, faded sepia portrait of Charlotte, now expertly restored to its true, vibrant colors, without any of the subtle alterations her father had made. Charlotte's bright, curious eyes, her mischievous smile, now shone with an authentic light. She was undeniably beautiful and uniquely herself. Next to it, a childhood photograph of Ellie, taken by her father, vibrant and clear. The resemblance was still there, undeniable. The same eyes, the same hair, the same mole. But now, Ellie saw the nuances, the subtle differences in their expressions, in the curve of their smiles. They were similar, yes, but distinct. Two separate souls. Ellie had spent weeks processing the revelation, allowing herself to grieve for the childhood she thought she had, and for the life of Charlotte Vance, who had been taken too soon. She had pored over her father's diary again, this time with a new perspective, appreciating the profound love he had for both of his daughters, the one he lost and the one he gained. She understood now her own inexplicable pull towards her profession. As a restorer of photographs, she had always been drawn to the stories held within faded images, the unseen lives captured in a single frame. It was as if, unconsciously, she had been searching for her own lost history, piecing together the fragments of a truth she hadn't known she was missing. Ellie had also revisited her recurring nightmares about drowning. With the knowledge of Charlotte's death, they no longer felt like random terrors. They felt like a connection, a somatic memory, an echo from a life she had touched, even if indirectly. She resolved to honor that connection, not with fear, but with understanding. She visited her father's grave, placing a fresh bouquet of white lilies, Charlotte's favorite flowers, as mentioned in the diary, alongside the roses her mother always brought. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me, and thank you for letting me find Charlotte." Her relationship with her mother had deepened immeasurably. The unspoken burden lifted. They could finally talk, truly talk, about everything. Sarah, in turn, found a new sense of peace, unburdened by the secret she had carried for so long. Ellie decided to create a special album, not just for her own family history, but for Charlotte's. It would contain the restored photograph, copies of the diary entries related to Charlotte, and the newspaper clipping. It would be a testament to a life lived, however briefly, and to the enduring power of memory and love. Chapter 8. A new chapter, a new story. Months passed. The old Charleston house, once a repository of hidden grief, now felt like a home filled with light and truth. Ellie continued her work as a photo restorer, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Each old photograph she touched felt like a kindred spirit, a silent story waiting to be heard, to be seen, to be brought back to life. One afternoon, a young couple brought in an old, badly damaged daguerreotype of a young woman, her face obscured by age and decay. "We don't know who she is," the woman explained, "but she's a part of our family history, somehow. Can you save her?" Ellie looked at the faint, ghostly image. "I'll do my best," she said, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She understood the profound need to connect with the past, to give a voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. She thought of Charlotte, her unwitting sister, her parallel. She thought of her father, Richard, who had loved so deeply that he had blurred the lines between reality and wish. And she thought of her mother, Sarah, whose love had been a fierce, protective shield. Eleanor Vance, was no longer just the shadow in the portrait. She was her own story, shaped by complex truths, born of immense love and profound loss. She carried Charlotte's echo within her, not as a burden, but as a tender reminder of the intricate tapestry of human connection. Her own life, once a blank slate unknowingly overwritten by another, was now hers to write, with full knowledge and a deep, abiding gratitude. She picked up the restored photograph of Charlotte. She looked at the vibrant face, the bright eyes, and she smiled. This wasn't just a shadow. This was a legacy. And Eleanor Vance, was ready to live her own story, full of light, full of truth, and full of the echoes of love that stretched across generations.